Hi everybody, and welcome to the online module to help us prepare for the timeline mapping workshop and get us ready for the session down in Giovannini Commons on Monday. So here we go. Just a real quick reminder of where we are as we're looking at the various steps along the way, right, that we began by framing our question, right, figuring out what the objective and intention of our project was, where the boundaries of that question lie, and use that to guide everything we do relative to the work and research that goes into it. And from there, we work to build our background research. This is the perspective that leads us to have expertise and current understanding in the topic. And from there, we would go obviously into an exploration of the future, beginning with our data mode, trend analysis, and the projections into the future, and then we go and bring uncertainty into the equation and include that as a big part of our process. Background research is where we are now, and in the last workshop on Wednesday we did our systems mapping, and that was our understanding of what are the boundaries of our system, what are the stakeholders and the forces of change in play, such that we have a really good understanding not just of how the system works, but also why it works that way. Now we move into historical analysis, and the tool that we use here is timeline mapping. The framework for this is really pretty straightforward and simple. It's the content and the thought and development that goes into how you approach your topic that really adds the value here. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this timeline process works. And so now we are in the historical analysis aspect. And what are we looking at when we talk about exploring historical timelines and that sort of thing? Well, we're looking at continuous change. That's trends. But we're also looking at the issues and events that come along, and with those triggers lead to a discontinuation of the prior era and a transition into the new era. And that's the whole objective. It's pretty tightly coupled to the idea of telling the story of our system, and it is really the intention and goal that we have with looking at historical assessment, is to understand where are those transitions, the end of a prior era and the start of a new one, because it tells us an awful lot about how to describe how the change may unfold in the future. So the goal here is to use timelines, right, sequential analysis of history to take us from the past up to the present. Not trying yet to describe the future, we're going to get there, but to just get a really good understanding of specifically what happened, when it happened, in what sequence, in what relation to other historical aspects, such that we can really describe the cohesive understanding of how change has unfolded. And what we'll see is that the past doesn't unfold in a singular sort of mode, but that there's multiple things going on, and that we want to look at multiple timelines. So what's a timeline? Pretty simple. We want to lay it out graphically. We want to look back twice as far as we look forward, right? So, if we're looking forward 10 years, we want to look back 20 years, and we want to map that out as change unfolds in a particular category. And as we understand our topics have complexity, there's multiple categories at work, and we've made enough progress with our framing and our understanding, not just of the central element of our topic, but of the various categories of change that are most impactful in describing how change has occurred and will occur, that we want to map multiple timelines. Okay, and so the idea here is that if we're looking at technological change and regulatory frameworks and demographic change, then we would want to have a timeline for each of those, and then the real value comes as we begin to synthesize and combine those. So develop an individual timeline for each category in your force field assessment, and then see where's the synthesis and how do they fit together. And then I want to introduce a new tool. It's a tool called the Janus curve, and this is a tool that came from the Foresight team out at Stanford, and I like it a lot because what it does is it takes the individual timelines, individual moments in time that occurred in some sequence, and it starts to create the understanding of the pattern, right? And so we call the groupings within this pattern eras, and the Janus curves help us take the timelines and bring them into a higher level understanding of the eras, what caused them, what the transition was like, and what the new era was. And I'll give you an example of how we use that. So let's look at the sustainability movement, right, and a timeline that has occurred. I've simplified this down a little bit, and you'll see there's several elements in here, but just for explanatory purposes, to give you guys an example, I've boiled it down to just a single timeline. And let's look at this. So as we came through the Industrial Revolution and into World War II, there wasn't a whole lot of understanding of or concern about the impact that we were having on the environment. But in the 1960s, we started to gain an awareness, and one of the main moments in time was this book called Silent Spring by a woman by the name of Rachel Carson. Maybe some of you have read this book. It's really a focus on chemicals and their impact on the environment, and in particular a pesticide called DDT that was a very effective pesticide, but was starting to cause all kinds of consequential impacts, right? Amphibians were not reproducing, and birds' eggs were not hardening, and so the offspring would die before they were born, and all of those sorts of things. And so that was a moment of awareness for our society. Another moment that came along was in the late 1960s, when pollution was sort of at its peak. In Cleveland, they had an event where the river that runs through Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River, actually caught on fire, and it was a very visual and shocking sort of thing that gave us a lot of awareness. As a consequence of that, society kind of mobilized, right? We created the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, and the first Earth Day, which was a sort of societal gathering and event, occurred in 1970. So we started to see regulation coming into place, societal pushback, and all of that sort of thing. From that, we see that business sort of got defensive, right? They decided to take the posture that these regulations were going to hurt their business and cause a lessening of overall societal well-being, that plastics made life better even if it caused a little bit of consequential pollution and that sort of thing. And that pushback was one of, minimize and delay, do as little as you can, and minimize the cost as best you could. Well, along through the 70s, we started to see that events started to occur. We had the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. Later in 1984, there was a chemical disaster in Bhopal, India, where a cyanide plant leaked and basically killed most of a town, and it caused a sense of awareness. Chernobyl was another nuclear accident in the late 80s, and then the Exxon Valdez was an oil tanker spill off the coast of Alaska. And all of a sudden, business started to realize they couldn't just push back against society, call it junk science and all of that sort of thing, and started to gain an awareness that they had to get out in front of this thing. Then along came a movement where we started to recognize more urgency around this, right? So we talked about the Brundtland definition for sustainable development. That was in 1987. In 1992, the first summit around the environment was held in Rio de Janeiro. The U.S. Green Building Council started an initiative on green building, right? And it was a small group, 1993, just slow and built from the grassroots on up. And then the Kyoto Protocol, 1997, around carbon and climate. We start to see these sorts of models come into play that don't just look at the problems, but start to envision solutions. And then from there, we see thought leaders and and new models start to come into play. The Ecology of Commerce was a book by a guy by the name of Paul Hawken that put in play the idea that business and ecology can coexist. Biomimicry, the idea that nature is a pretty good example of innovation, and if we followed some of the lead there, we would be able to create less harmful innovations by looking at the way nature does. Natural capitalism took it a step further and said we have to value natural capital, and that it is absolutely consistent with market economies and that sort of thing if we do it right. And then cradle to cradle, the idea of that there is no a way that that it's not an open-ended system; it's a closed-loop system, and the idea that we need to design our products in that very similar sort of way. And then in the most recent times, the latest big global gathering around climate in Copenhagen about 5 years ago had huge expectations and hopes, and really ended up with very little movement because of disagreement between the developed and developing worlds and that sort of thing. And then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the scientific body that's doing a lot of research and publication around carbon and climate came about, and they had a huge scandal where they were doctoring their results and it became public. So this, you can see the timeline sort of comes into play. So how do we use this timeline to define our eras? Well, let's bring a Janus cone into play. So here's our same timeline, and we see that if we lay the Janus cone on top of that, what we can do is recognize that we had an era of awakening. We had a subsequent era of reluctant compliance, business pushing back and trying to make the regulations and the momentum go away. And then this idea that, hey, there's actually triple bottom line value if we do this right, and 3 eras. And a couple of points about this. You can see that the eras sort of map with and align with the sequence of events, but also by giving them a name and an identity, it helps us to understand them. It really helps us tell the story. So, what do we want to do? Well, we want to get into this workshop and keep our momentum going, right? That our current assessment, which is due at the end of the week, will be basically 3 main points, right? Your framing lens, your historical assessment, and your systems assessment. And so for here, I want you to do the historical assessment using your force field assessment as a springboard to get you in there. What are the categories that you need to do the timelines for? Map multiple timelines that are aligned with the categories in your central question, and then use Janus cones to define the relevant eras and the triggers that cause the transition. And if you do these things, you should have the ability to tell a pretty cohesive and clear story of the historical assessment as it sits alongside of your systems assessment within the boundaries of your framing lens. One more point is that you're going to need to be creative, right? There is no single cookie cutter. I can't give you a template to say that this is what Appendix B for your timeline assessment is for the current assessment assignment. You have to be creative and come up with something that fits. What it needs to do is tell the historical flow over the past, say, 20 years, if 10 years is your time window, and use that as a means of figuring out what you need to write about in your current assessment. So it's an ambiguous challenge, but by doing it with this structure, it should give you the ability to really get your arms around this. And so that's the challenge. Think about how you want to prepare and think about your topic before you get into the workshop. And when we get into the workshop, again, we're going to hit the ground running at the very start and try to give you the full 75 minutes. So remember, we're in Giovannini Commons on Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we will see you on Monday. Thanks.